Good evening and welcome back. And tonight, and I want to get this right before we go anywhere, so stay with me for a second. Tonight, I want you to feel something before we even begin. Something specific, the particular quality of a silence that isn't empty. You're somewhere quiet right now, or quieter than before. And the day is losing its grip on you the way days do when you finally stop letting them hold on. And I want you to notice what's actually in the dark with you, because it isn't nothing. It's something older than sound, something that has been here, patient in a way that doesn't feel like waiting, because it isn't waiting for anything in particular, just present, just here, at this precise and unrepeatable hour, this exact breath you're drawing right now, this specific moment when you slowed down enough to let the night say what it has to say. You're in your bed or your chair or whatever corner of the world you've managed to claim as private tonight. And the noise is going, the noise of being a person alive in this particular era, with its demands and its notifications and its insistence that your attention is always owed to something urgent. That noise is receding, and I want you to notice what's underneath it, what was always underneath it, because what remains when the noise goes is something human beings have been practicing in the dark since before we had words for it, since before fire, since the first of us looked up at the stars and felt that ache, that specific ache of wondering whether anything in all that wheeling black overhead knew we were down here, looking. Tonight, we're going into a silence that has been building for more than 1,000 years. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, there are cities, stone pyramids that break through the jungle canopy and point at a sky they haven't spoken to in 12 centuries, their summits catching light no ceremony has witnessed in a very long time. Great plazas, long ceremonial causeways now threaded through completely by the roots of enormous trees, roots the width of a person's body, patient and absolute. Limestone surfaces that were once painted brilliant red and white. Brilliant in a way I find genuinely difficult to picture, even when I try. Painted like something that wanted to be seen from very far away. And now, they are the color of shadow and moss, and 1,200 years of the green world doing what the green world does, which is take back, slowly, everything. These temples rang once. I mean that plainly. They rang, priest chanting, ceremonial drums with a sound that must have moved through the body before it reached the ears. Tens of thousands of people gathered in those plazas, the heat of all those bodies, the noise of all those voices, and the stone underneath absorbing. And here, I'm not entirely sure what I mean. I kept this detail and I'm still circling it. The stone absorbing the weight of being the center of something, the axis, the place the world turned around. Now there is only wind in the canopy, a bird somewhere deep in the green, calling across a void that used to be full of everything. Here is what I need you to hold before we take a single step further. And it matters how you hold it. These cities are not ruins, and I know how that lands. Every photograph of Tikal or Palenque or Copan frames them as ruins, presents them through the romantic and melancholy framing of things that once were and are no longer. And that framing is doing something dishonest or maybe just careless, because these cities are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of something more complicated than failure and considerably more human. A civilization that built the impossible, that held it together for 6 centuries, that then faced a convergence of crises so total, so interlocking, so precisely arranged by circumstance to defeat every strategy that human intelligence could bring to bear, that what is actually astonishing when you sit with it honestly is that the cities stood as long as they did, burned as brightly, and that the people who built them are still here, still counting the days, still weaving the colors, still planting the corn. Tonight, we're going into the silent cities to investigate the fall, and what we'll find isn't a defeated people. It's a civilization that met its limits and a people who survived meeting them. And the story is more complex and more urgent than anyone initially suspected, and more human than the ruins framing allows. But before we go further, and I mean this plainly, not as a performance of sincerity, though I recognize saying that is exactly what a performance of sincerity would include, which is a trap I can't fully escape. If you're here, in this quiet hour, setting aside whatever the day cost you to think about something ancient and lost, I'm glad. And if this journey is worth your time, a like and a subscription make a real difference. And please leave me something in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are right now, because there is something genuinely strange and good about knowing these stories are traveling outward into corners I'll never see, arriving in dark hours I'll never share. Now settle in. Let the day go. Let the last of the noise recede. Let your breathing slow. And understand, before we take a single step into the jungle, that you are about to hear the story of people who believed they were holding the sky in place with their blood, and who, in a sense, were right. To understand why the cities fell silent, you first have to understand the world that existed before the silence came. And that world is nothing like what the first European scholars who eventually stumbled onto the ruins were willing to imagine, in the prevailing intellectual position of the 18th and early 19th century held it with the serene confidence of people who had never been asked to question the shape of their own assumptions, that no truly great indigenous civilization could have arisen in the Americas. This was not simply prejudice, though prejudice was load-bearing throughout. It was a systematic position, propped up by respected authority, decided before the evidence arrived. History was permitted a certain shape. The shape did not include this, so the reports drifted in and got set aside. Missionaries pressing into unfamiliar territory, indigenous traders on ancient forest paths, local woodsmen who stumbled into vast clearings, dominated by enormous stone structures, draped entirely in vegetation. Reports were received the way you receive something a weary traveler says after too many nights alone in the dark, with patience and without belief. The jungle interior of Central America was to the European colonial world that had begun pressing across the Americas a place of discomfort and very little interest. The great stone cities slept on, undisturbed by scholarship. Their pyramids accumulated soil and roots and time until they were indistinguishable from the natural hills of the landscape, until a traveler passing through that rainforest in 1400 or 1500 or 1700 could walk within 50 yards of the summit of one of the greatest pyramids ever built in the ancient world and register nothing but trees, a hill, the noise of insects, the drip of canopy water, just the forest the whole way through. It took two men to break the fantasy open, and they were almost comically mismatched in temperament, which is maybe why it worked. The first was John Lloyd Stevens, lawyer by training, diplomat by occasional appointment, travel writer by genuine and consuming vocation. His books about Egypt and Arabia and Greece had made him famous, and not just famous the way that era manufactured fame, but famous because the writing was actually good, because he could put a reader inside the heat and the dust and the strangeness of an unfamiliar world with something approaching physical immediacy, which is a thing that's easy to describe and very hard to do. Beneath the literary gifts and the easy social grace, there was something else, a real intellectual seriousness, a man who wanted to understand what he saw, not merely to have seen it. And the second was Frederick Catherwood, British architect and artist, precise, methodical, and possessed of a commitment to visual accuracy that edged toward the obsessive. He had spent years in the Middle East and Egypt drawing ancient monuments. And what distinguished him, what made him genuinely useful to history, was that he drew what was actually there, not what he hoped to find, not what would make a beautiful picture. What was there? In 1839, they went in together. The territory was unmapped and politically volatile, and the jungle was dense and dripping, and the fevers were real. They hacked through it with machetes. They negotiated safe passage through the territories of suspicious and heavily armed local commanders. They followed a trail of whispered reports toward a site near the Copan River in what is now Honduras. And one day, they stepped into a clearing, and I find this moment hard to handle without either overstating it or going flat. I'll try to stay level. Rising from the jungle floor around them were the stelae of Copan, tall carved stone pillars, each one dense from base to crown with imagery of extraordinary complexity, portraits of ancient kings rendered with formal authority, and something else, something that reads as psychological presence, a specificity of face that insists on being looked at as a face, geometric patterns of elaborate sophistication, and winding through all of it, a script, dense and pictorial, and unlike anything either man had encountered before, but clearly a script, clearly a language, a communication from one intelligence to another, reaching across a distance of time that neither man could yet measure. It was Catherwood who recognized it first, from his years in the old world. The cutting was precise. The composition was balanced. The portraiture showed an understanding of the human face that couldn't be waved away as primitive or accidental. This was a culture working at the highest levels of artistic sophistication, and Catherwood knew what that looked like because he had spent his career in the presence of it. It was Stevens who grasped the historical weight. Everything about these monuments spoke of something entirely indigenous, entirely native to this specific corner of the world, rooted in the soil and the sky and the cosmology of people who had grown out of this landscape and arrived by their own road at a level of civilization that demanded to be understood on its own terms. Stevens was so convinced of the importance of what he was standing in that he formally purchased the ruins from their bewildered local owner for $50 American, and he entertained briefly the idea of shipping the entire site to New York. The practicalities surfaced quickly. The plan was abandoned. Catherwood set to work. The conditions were almost comically bad. Extraordinary heat, hands swollen from insect bites, jungle light that shifted constantly and committed to nothing. He produced drawings of the Copan stellae that were the opposite of the romanticized, impressionistic visions European artists typically made of exotic ruins. They were precise, honest, and showed the carvings as they actually were, which made them, paradoxically, more astonishing than any romanticized version could have managed. In truth, turned out to be the more dramatic option. When Stevens published his account, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, illustrated with Catherwood's drawings, it became an immediate international sensation. It demolished, publicly and with illustrated evidence, the comfortable old assumption. And in finding the cities, Stevens and Catherwood uncovered the question that would occupy archaeologists and historians for 2 centuries. Who built these magnificent cities, and why, at the height of their power, did they walk away from them? Let me collect the thread here, because the answer is complicated in the ways that matter. The classic Maya period, the era of the great cities, the divine kings, and the stone monuments, and the fully developed writing system, and the pyramids that broke through the canopy, ran from roughly 250 AD to 900 AD, 6.5 centuries. During that time, the Maya of the southern lowlands built a civilization that was, by any serious measure, one of the most intellectually and artistically advanced on the planet. The first thing to understand about them is what they were: a single unified empire answering to one capital, one king, one administrative center. That is what they were not, and the word Maya is a modern convenience, a shorthand that covers dozens of distinct kingdoms and city-states and regional powers that shared a common cultural tradition, a common writing system, a common religious worldview, common artistic conventions, common calendrical systems of staggering sophistication. Politically, though they were independent of one another, often fiercely so, the landscape of the classic Maya world was a dynamic and volatile and perpetually shifting network of city-states. Each one controlled its own agricultural hinterland, its own networks of tribute-paying subsidiary communities, each presided over by its own divine king, each engaged in continuous diplomatic maneuvering and military competition with its neighbors, the full range of it, strategic royal marriages designed to bind dynasties or project influence into neighboring territories, long bitter wars, dramatic reversals, cities that rose to regional dominance and then fell to a rival coalition. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Quiriguá, Piedras Negras, Yaxchilán, Caracol. These were rivals, and we can read their histories now from the stone monuments with a clarity that would have seemed impossible to scholars a century ago. What those histories show is the full texture of political life: ambition, betrayal, alliance, collapse, the whole exhausting and familiar apparatus of human power, organized at scale. Anyway, above all of it loomed a rivalry. Tikal against the carnal kingdom, the serpent kingdom, whose political influence at its height spread across a vast swath of the Maya lowlands through a sophisticated network of vassals and allies, a web of obligation and threat and calculated loyalty that it's not unlike certain things we'd recognize. I won't press the comparison, but it surfaces, and I notice it, and I let it pass. In beneath all of it, beneath the rivalry and the alliances and the stone monuments and the shifting coalitions of divine kings, there was a single plant, maize, corn, the extraordinary grass that Mesoamerican peoples had domesticated from its wild ancestor millennia before the great cities rose, and that had become across the whole of Central America not merely a food, but something harder to name, a cosmological foundation, a sacred substance. In the Popol Vuh, the great highland Maya book of creation, the gods fashioned the first true human beings from cornmeal dough. Literally, humanity in this telling is made of corn. To plant corn is to participate in the sacred act of creation. To harvest it is to receive the gift of life renewed. The cycle of the corn, planting and growth, and harvest and fallow, a rain and drought and rain again, is the cycle of cosmic time, the fundamental rhythm to which all other rhythms are tuned. I want to say something about the agriculture here, and I want to say it plainly, because this section deserves plainness. The tropical rainforest of the Maya lowlands looks fertile. It is not, particularly. The apparent abundance of the jungle is a function of the rapid cycling of nutrients through living biomass, not deep, rich soil. Clear the forest, and you expose thin topsoil to intense seasonal rains and a relentless sun, and it degrades fast. The challenge of growing corn in sufficient quantities to support the large, dense populations of the classic cities was formidable. The Maya met it with agricultural ingenuity and sheer accumulated labor. Stone-faced terraces on hillsides and ridges, elaborate raised field systems in the low-lying swampy areas, long narrow platforms of soil and organic matter lifted above the flood level and separated by canals. A landscape engineering project carried out across generations that reshaped the physical geography of the lowlands. The scale of that labor is difficult to hold in the mind clearly. I find I keep sliding off it. At the center of this sacred agricultural drama stood the king, the Kuhul Ajal, the Holy Lord. He was not a political ruler in any modern administrative sense, or rather, he was that, but that was incidental. His primary function was to serve as a living bridge between the ordinary human world and the supernatural realm of the gods and the royal ancestors. His primary duty was to perform the sacred rituals that maintained the order of the cosmos, in that ensured the sun would rise, that the seasons would turn in their proper sequence, that the rain would come when the corn needed it. This cosmic responsibility took its most visceral form in royal bloodletting. In the most important religious ceremonies, the king would pierce his own body, tongue, earlobes, other flesh, using instruments of extraordinary sharpness, a finely worked obsidian lancet, a stingray spine, a sharpened sliver of bone. The blood was caught on strips of bark paper, held in a wide-mouthed ceramic bowl. The paper, saturated with the sacred blood of the Holy Lord, was burned. In the column of smoke that rose from the burning, the Maya believed a portal opened, what they called the vision serpent, a supernatural conduit through which the king could communicate directly with the gods and with his royal ancestors. petitioning them for rain and harvest and victory, and the continuation of the cosmic order. These were not private ceremonies. They were performed in the great open plazas before enormous audiences. The king's willingness to suffer and to bleed and to humble himself before the powers on which all life depended was the public proof of his fitness to rule, his fulfillment of the bargain on which civilization rested. The people provided the labor, the tribute of corn that fed the king and his court and his armies of priests and craftsmen and artisans. The king provided the sacred blood and the ritual expertise that maintained the relationship with the gods. As long as both sides held, the world was in balance. The corn would grow. The cities would flourish. The great interlocking gears of the Maya calendar would turn without interruption. And it was a coherent system, genuinely, organically coherent. Cosmology and agriculture and political authority and artistic expression and daily social life integrated into a single unified whole in a way that I find, and here I'll admit the narrator's difficulty, that I find moving in a way I struggle to fully account for. There's something about a civilization that has made its god out of its food, that has decided the king holds the sky in place with his blood, that organized an entire intellectual tradition around the question of whether the bargain between the human and the supernatural would hold. Something about that level of commitment to a premise. The premise worked. For centuries it worked, or appeared to work. That during the long, benign centuries, when the climate of the Maya lowlands was stable and the rains arrived when the corn expected them, the cities grew, the monuments rose, the plazas filled with bodies and sound, and the smoke of burning bark paper carrying the blood of holy men upward into a sky that, for a very long time, answered. Then the sky stopped answering, and the system, the whole interlocking, deeply coherent, organically unified system, was built on a promise that turned out to be, in the final analysis, extraordinarily fragile. A promise that the rain would come, a promise that the bargain would hold, a promise that the king's blood was enough. It wasn't a flaw in the design. The design was extraordinary. It was something worse, a flaw in the world the design had to operate inside, a world that was about to change in ways no amount of ritual precision could address. No stingray spine, no burning paper, no column of smoke rising into the hot, still air above a plaza full of watching faces. The cities didn't know that yet. For a while longer, the gears turned. For decades after Stevens and Catherwood walked into that clearing, the most tantalizing and most frustrating thing about the ruins was the writing. It was everywhere, covering the monuments, inscribed into the temples, painted in dense fluid columns across ceramic vessels by scribes who handled the glyphs with a fluency and confidence that spoke unmistakably of a fully developed literary tradition. And for the better part of a century after the rediscovery, it was completely opaque, impenetrably, maddeningly opaque. The prevailing interpretation, championed most influentially by the British archaeologist J. Eric S. Thompson, a figure of enormous intellectual authority who dominated Maya studies for the middle decades of the 20th century, held that the glyphs were not in any meaningful sense a true writing system, primarily ideographic and symbolic notation, Thompson argued. pictorial representations of abstract concepts, celestial movements, cycles of the sacred calendar, a civilization whose concerns were with the heavens rather than the messy specificities of human political history. To imagine the glyphs could spell out actual words in a spoken language, could record the names of kings, the dates of their births, the details of their military victories, was, Thompson insisted, a romantic fantasy. For decades, his view held. The Maya remained to the scholarly world a people without history in the conventional sense, a civilization of magnificent monuments and profound mystery, whose internal life, whose politics, whose human stories would remain forever inaccessible. The cities could be measured and mapped and photographed. They could not speak. The first crack came from a direction no one was looking, in Yuri Knorozov, young Russian linguist, working in a small state-owned apartment in post-war Leningrad with limited resources, a few published volumes of Maya inscriptions, some secondary literature, and the disciplined, patient, creative intelligence of a man who had spent years thinking about how writing systems actually work. Knorozov brought to the problem a linguist's crucial insight that most writing systems are mix systems, encoding language at multiple levels simultaneously, sometimes through logograms representing whole words or concepts, sometimes through phonetic signs representing the sounds of syllables in the spoken language. He worked with a colonial-era document compiled by a Spanish priest named Diego de Landa, who had asked Maya informants to tell him what glyph represented each letter of the Spanish alphabet, a process based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the script functioned, but one that had nonetheless captured genuine phonetic information about individual signs. Knorozov began testing the hypothesis that many Maya glyphs were phonetic syllabic signs. When he treated them that way and combined them according to the rules of known Mayan languages, they produced real words, actual Mayan words that could be read aloud, that had meanings, that corresponded to objects and concepts in the living world. His papers were published in Russian in the 1950s. They were brilliant. They were also largely ignored by the Western academic establishment, partly for the predictable political reasons of the Cold War, and partly because Thompson reviewed Knorozov's work with withering dismissiveness, the kind of dismissiveness that only someone with Thompson's accumulated institutional authority could deploy so effectively. So the crack sealed over, the wall held. I need to pause here because Thompson bothers me in a way that's probably disproportionate, and I'm aware of it. There's something about a man who uses the weight of his reputation to keep a door closed, a door behind which, it turns out, actual human beings are waiting to be heard, that I find it hard to move past quickly. So, I'm noting it, moving on. The person who finally blew the door off its hinges was not a linguist. She was a draftsman and artist named Tatiana Proskuryakov, who had come to Maya studies through her skills as an architectural illustrator, and whose years of close, intimate, detailed study of the stone monuments had given her a knowledge of the physical inscriptions that was almost cellular. While analyzing a group of stelae from the site of Piedras Negras on the Usumacinta River, she noticed something that had somehow never been properly registered. The dates carved on a single stela taken together spanned roughly 60 to 80 years, precisely the length of a human lifespan. she saw what she was looking at. These were not records of abstract astronomical cycles. They were biographies. The earliest date on each monument corresponded to a specific glyph she identified as meaning birth, or arrival, or the beginning of something. A slightly later date corresponded to another recurring glyph she interpreted as accession, the taking of power in the moment a king assumed his throne, a final date recording the end of the reign, likely through death. Her 1960 paper in American Antiquity proved it with a rigor impossible to dismiss. The Maya stelae were historical documents, records of the births and accessions and military victories and marriages and deaths of actual historical human beings, kings and queens with names and life stories embedded in the specifics of real political and military time. The effect on Maya studies was seismic. A new generation of scholars working collaboratively began making astonishing strides, and this is the part I find it hardest to rush through, so I won't. The names of the great kings began emerging from the stone. Kinich Janab Pakal of Palank, who ruled for nearly 70 years and whose jade masked sarcophagus discovered deep inside the temple of the inscriptions had been the most spectacular archaeological find of the century. Spear thrower owl and Seaj Kahak, the shadowy figures associated with a great political intervention from distant Teotihuacan that had reshaped the entire political landscape of the Central Petén in the 4th century. The long dynastic sequence of Kapan's 17 named kings, carved in extraordinary detail on the great hieroglyphic stairway, and the bitter multi-generational rivalry between Tikal and Karnul, the Serpent Kingdom, whose shifting fortunes of war and diplomacy were recorded in loving and sometimes openly gloating detail by scribes on both sides. Anyway, the silent cities had found their voices, and what they said, what the stone had been holding patiently for 12 centuries, waiting for someone to learn to listen, was, in the deepest and most human sense, everything. The names, the dates, the victories, the losses, the specific faces of specific kings who had believed they were holding the sky in place with their blood, and who had bled accordingly, and whose names we can now speak aloud in the dark across an abyss of time they could not have imagined, into an hour they would not recognize. We know who they were. That still gets me, if I'm honest. Every time, to walk through the ruins of a great Maya city, even now, even diminished, even cracked and colonized by roots, is to encounter at every turn evidence of an intelligence that was simultaneously deeply practical and profoundly visionary. Platforms leveled with a precision that requires careful surveying. The corbelled vaults of the temples engineered to distribute weight in ways that have kept them standing for 12 centuries. The Great Pyramid stairways oriented deliberately to align with significant astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of Venus, the paths of the constellations, because everything in the built environment of the classic Maya was, in some sense, a cosmological instrument. The city was not just a place to live and work and govern. It was a model of the universe, a three-dimensional map of the relationship between the human world and the supernatural realm above and below it. This cosmological orientation rested on mathematics. The Maya developed a number system of elegant and powerful simplicity, vigesimal, base 20, and arranged vertically rather than horizontally. A single dot representing 1, a horizontal bar representing 5, combinations of dots above bars, allowing any number from 1 to 19 to be expressed with 3 symbols or fewer. Beautiful in its economy, and at the foundation of the entire system, holding it up, making it work in ways that many other ancient number systems simply could not. A symbol representing 0. The Maya invention of 0 is one of the great intellectual leaps in the history of human thought, and I want to say that plainly without dressing it up, because it tends to get dressed up in ways that actually diminish it. The ancient Romans, with all their engineering genius, never managed it. Their number system had no 0, which meant large-scale calculation carried a clumsiness and unreliability that the Maya, Sikhs with their positional system, did not have. 0 is not a small thing. 0 is the thing that makes calculation tractable at scale. The Maya had it, and they needed it because time was their obsession. Not time for convenience, not time for purely practical agricultural scheduling. Time as sacred structure. The Maya believed the universe moved in great repeating cycles, each governed by its own divine forces, and that by understanding those cycles, by tracking their intersections and alignments with meticulous precision, it was possible to read the nature of any given moment, to know what forces were active in the world, what dangers were present, what opportunities existed, what rituals were required. Time in this framework was not a neutral medium through which events passed. Time had character. Time had pressure. To serve this project, the Maya developed not one calendar, but a system of interlocking calendars working simultaneously, like gears of different sizes, their interactions generating patterns of extraordinary complexity. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred calendar combining 20 named day signs with 13 numbers in a cycle that had been in use across Mesoamerica for thousands of years. Each of the 260 unique days carried its own character, its own presiding deity, its own implications for divination and ritual. You were born on a specific Tzolk'in day. That day's characteristics were understood to shape your personality and your fate for the entirety of your life. This is not metaphor. This is the operating premise of a civilization. Running simultaneously, the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar governing the agricultural seasons, and divided into 18 named months of 20 days each, plus a short 5-day period at the year's end, considered deeply inauspicious. A dangerous gap in the fabric of ordered time, a moment when the usual rules did not apply. I find myself wanting to linger on those 5 days, the uncanny 5, the days when the structure briefly failed to hold. But I'll keep moving, because 260 and 365 share no common factor other than 5. It takes exactly 52 Hab years, 18,980 days, for any given combination of a Tzolk'in day and a Hab day to repeat. This 52-year cycle was the fundamental unit of historical time for most Mesoamerican civilizations. Its end was marked with significant ceremonial activity because the world at that moment was understood to be at a point of cosmic vulnerability and renewal simultaneously, the hinge point. It held breath. For tracking history across longer spans, the Maya developed the long count, a linear count of the total number of days elapsed since a mythological creation date placed in what corresponds to August 11th or 13th of 3114 BC by our Gregorian calendar, running forward without repeating, accumulating days in a great unbroken linear sequence that allowed any date in Maya history to be specified with absolute and unambiguous precision. Let me collect the thread here, because this matters for what comes later. When a Maya king commissioned a stela to commemorate a military victory or a royal accession, the sculptor carved the long count date alongside the other inscriptions. Because we can correlate the long count with our own calendar with a high degree of certainty, those dates convert directly into specific days of specific years in the modern Gregorian system. We know that Kinich Janab Pakal of Palank was born on March the 23rd, 603 AD. We know he acceded to the throne on July 29th, 615 AD. Not from external historical records, not from radiocarbon dating with its statistical uncertainty, from what he had carved in stone himself. He told us, across 14 centuries he told us, and we finally learned to listen. The astronomical program that this calendar system served was, and here I'll admit I keep reaching for qualifiers and pulling back from them because they all feel insufficient. It was extraordinary in its patience. Maya priest astronomers, working from the flat-topped summits of their pyramids, tracked the rising and setting points of the sun across the year and measured the length of the solar year with a precision that rivaled the best calculations of the ancient old world. They tracked the moon with equal care. They measured its synodic period with an accuracy within a fraction of a second per day compared to modern measurements. They predicted solar and lunar eclipses and recorded those predictions in their bark paper books, most of which did not survive. Venus was a particular obsession. Its synodic period of approximately 584 days, calculated to within a fraction of a day. The larger cycle in which the Venus synodic period meshes with the solar year worked out precisely. Every 8 solar years, every 5 Venus synodic periods, Venus returns to almost exactly the same position in the sky on the same day of the solar year. This 8-year cycle was tracked with great care. The moments when Venus emerged from its inferior conjunction as the morning star were watched with particular attention. Moments of cosmic significance often associated in the inscriptions with the launching of military campaigns. Venus rising, time to move. All of it, the mathematics, the interlocking calendars, the astronomical observation, was part of a single unified intellectual project, the attempt to read the divine order of the cosmos and to align human life, and specifically royal ritual action, with the rhythms of that order. It was simultaneously humbling and empowering, this vision. Humbling because it acknowledged the smallness of human beings inside an immense cosmic system. Empowering because it insisted that human ritual action performed correctly at the right time had real consequences for the behavior of that system. The king's blood at the right moment, on the right day, under the right configuration of the interlocking gears. This was not symbolic. This was engineering. Sacred engineering, yes, but engineering with expected outcomes, with a theory of mechanism, with the possibility of failure. And it would fail. The science was remarkable. The art it produced was remarkable. The intellectual tradition that held it all together was one of the genuine achievements of human civilization on this planet. And I mean that without reservation. But the system rested on a premise. The premise was that the cosmic order was stable, that the sky would continue to behave the way the sky had always behaved, that the rain would come when the calculations said the rain should come, that the gears of the universe would keep turning on their predicted courses. The gears were about to slip. Around the year 750 AD, the world of the classic Maya in the southern lowlands must have seemed to anyone living inside it as permanent and as fixed as the stone pyramids that broke the skyline of every great city. 5 centuries of building, 5 centuries of deepening and elaborating, of the civilization growing more itself, adding layers to layers, the urban centers thriving with populations that numbered in the tens of thousands. A density of human occupation remarkable for any pre-modern, pre-industrial society, and simply extraordinary in the context of a tropical rainforest that demanded constant skilled agricultural labor just to keep everyone fed. Tikal, in the central Petén forest of what is now Guatemala, was by any serious measure one of the great cities of the ancient world. Its core zone covered several square kilometers of intensively planned urban space. Its plazas connected by elevated stone causeways radiating outward from the center like spokes. And around this core, for miles in every direction, extended the dense semi-planned residential zone where ordinary people lived. A vast suburban landscape of stone and thatch structures separated by gardens and orchards and small family milpa plots. Modern archaeological surveys using LIDAR imaging have revealed this zone to be far more extensive and far more densely inhabited than anyone previously imagined. Estimates for Tikal's total population at its peak range from 60,000 to perhaps as many as 120,000 people, in numbers that would have made it one of the largest cities in the world in the mid-8th century. Above all of it, the pyramid temples of Tikal's kings rose like stone mountains. Temple 1, the temple of the great jaguar, built over the tomb of Jasar Chankawil, rising 47 meters above the level of the Great Plaza. Temple 4, the tallest of all, rising 65 meters above the jungle floor, its summit offering a view across an unbroken green ocean of rainforest canopy stretching to the horizon in every direction. I've tried to imagine standing up there. I'm not sure I can do it accurately. The sheer scale of what human beings had carved out of this improbable landscape, visible all at once, the canopy going on forever, and the city beneath you, and the two facts in impossible coexistence. In the northeast of the Maya world, at Copan, the artisans in the court of the 16th king in the dynastic line were completing the hieroglyphic stairway, a monumental staircase whose risers were covered in some 2,200 individual glyph blocks, the longest single hieroglyphic text in the ancient Americas, narrating the full history of the Copan dynasty from its beginning. Every king, every accession, the whole story climbing upward in stone, In the northwest at Palang, the legacy of the great Pakal was being elaborated by his successors. The palace complex, a sprawling multi-storied labyrinth of vaulted rooms and sunken courtyards, dominated by an unusual 4-story tower that may have served as an astronomical observation post. Its walls covered in painted stucco reliefs of extraordinary delicacy, the royal family in the company of gods and supernatural animals, that the living and the dead in perpetual conversation through the medium of sacred ritual. The dead were not gone at Palang. They were present, consulted, depicted mid-sentence. Across the lowlands, the great rhythms of classic Maya life continued with what must have felt like the inevitability of seasons. The corn was planted when the calendar said to plant it. The kings performed their bloodletting rituals at the appointed times. The stone workers shaped their monuments. The scribes wrote their texts. The merchants traveled the river and overland routes with their cargoes of obsidian and jade and pyrite and salt and cacao. The great ball courts echoed with the impact of the rubber ball. And here I keep wanting to stop on this detail. The rubber ball, the sound of it, the specific acoustic quality of that impact in a stone court at the height of a Maya city's power, which is something I cannot reconstruct and probably shouldn't pretend to. The market plazas filled and emptied with the rhythms of the trading cycles. It was a world at the absolute height of its powers. It carried in its monuments and its texts and its accumulated traditions the weight and the confidence of an ancient and successful civilization. The confidence of something that has been working for a very long time and has no immediate reason to suspect it will stop. And it was also, though no one living inside it could have known this. And I find that fact difficult to sit with for reasons I can't entirely articulate. A world in the last generations of its existence. Beneath the apparent solidity of the stone cities, forces were building, in the sky, in the soil, in the violent dynamics of the political system that had been escalating for generations, the warfare growing more frequent, the tributary demands growing more extractive, the agricultural landscape being pushed harder and harder toward its limits by populations that had grown very large in a very demanding environment. The gears of the cosmos were not slipping yet. The calendar still turned. The kings still bled on schedule. The smoke still rose. But the forces were building. And within a century and a half, in the span of perhaps 4 or 5 human generations, not long at all, not long enough for any individual life to witness the full arc of it, this magnificent world would go silent. The monuments would stop being carved. The kings would stop performing their rituals. The population would collapse. The forests would move in. And the pyramids would become hills. And a traveler passing through would see nothing but trees. And the first sign that something was going profoundly wrong is not a dramatic discovery. It is an absence, a silence. For centuries, the kings of the great Maya city-states had been obsessive and prolific commissioners of public monuments. The stone stela, a tall flat-sided pillar typically carved with the portrait of the king, his name and titles, and royal descent. Long count dates commemorating specific events in his reign was the primary medium of royal self-presentation in the classic Maya world. And because nearly every monument carries a precise long count date, the archaeological record of stellar erection, allows us to track the political health of individual city-states with an accuracy that is genuinely extraordinary. We can watch the pulse. And beginning in the last decades of the 8th century, the pulse starts to falter. At Palenque, the last firmly dated monument corresponds to 799 AD, after which the stone is silent. No new monuments, no new rulers commemorated, no new texts recording the births and victories and sacred performances of a continuing dynasty. Centuries of unbroken royal commemoration, and then nothing. At Copan, the last securely dated monument falls in 822 AD. The sculptors, who had for generations produced some of the most technically accomplished stone carving in the ancient Americas, set down their tools. Permanently, as it turned out. At Quirigua, the extraordinary sequence of colossal stelae ends in 810 AD. At Piedras Negras, 795 AD. At Tikal, the great superpower, the city of 120,000 people, the temple of the Great Jaguar, rising 47 meters above the plaza. The last securely dated stela carries a long count date, corresponding to 869 AD, after which silence. One by one, across roughly 150 years, the great cities of the classic Maya heartland go quiet. The tradition of royal monument making that had been the primary medium of royal self-expression for more than 5 centuries simply ceases. Not at one city, not at two, at all of them, in a rolling wave of silence, moving from the western edge of the lowlands eastward and northward, each city going mute in turn. The stone inscriptions are not the only evidence. The archaeology of the cities themselves tells a story that makes the silence of the stelae far more ominous. Evidence of massive construction projects begun and never finished. Elaborate new temple complexes whose lower platforms and stairways were built with great care and then simply abandoned mid-construction. Carved stone blocks clearly intended for finished monuments, found lying in or near their quarries, still in the rough-cut state of their initial shaping, waiting to receive the hand of sculptors who never came. I keep returning to those blocks. There's something about them I find hard to move past cleanly. The specific material fact of the intention that remains in them. The weight of an unfinished sentence. I'm not sure the image is as precise as I want it to be, but I kept it. These were not projects interrupted by a single violent event. The unfinished construction speaks of something slower and more grinding. A society running out of something essential, whether resources or labor or the organizational capacity to keep large-scale projects moving forward, or simply the will to keep investing in the symbols of an order that was no longer delivering on its promises. The bargain was breaking down. The king bled, and the rain did not come, and the corn did not grow, and the people were hungry, and the monuments stood half-made in the quarries, and nobody came back for them. At some sites, the evidence becomes more specific. Archaeologists excavating the residential zones of once great cities have found evidence of progressive abandonment. Large, well-built stone structures of the elite showing signs of a process, first abandoned by their original aristocratic occupants, then reoccupied informally by people of much lower status. Crude cooking hearths on fine plaster floors the detritus of simple domestic activity in rooms that were once elegantly appointed, squatters, essentially, camping in the shells of palaces in the ruins of a world that no longer functioned. At some sites, there is evidence of something more violent than mere social dissolution. Hastily constructed defensive walls thrown up around the central ceremonial cores of cities that had previously been open and architecturally confident. The fortifications not of a secure and well-organized military power, but of a frightened community assembling whatever barriers it could manage quickly. Mass graves, skeletons bearing the marks of violent death, large-scale conflict that went far beyond the ritualized elite prisoner-taking of the high classic period. The world of the classic Maya in its final century was becoming, by degrees, as a world of fear, the open, elaborate, confident urban spaces of the high classic period contracting and closing, the sophisticated trade networks breaking down, the craftsman producing less, and producing it with a declining standard that is not the gradual creative evolution of an artistic tradition, but the sharper, less disciplined decline of a society losing the social organization and resource base needed to sustain complex craftwork. The difference is visible in the objects themselves, in the declining fluency of the glyph carving, in the cruder execution of the pottery, in all the small material ways that a civilization signals it is running out of the surplus that makes refinement possible. Let me collect the thread here, because one thing needs to be said clearly before we go further. In the northern Maya lowlands, in the drier, flatter terrain of the Yucatan Peninsula, a different story was unfolding. Cities there, most notably Chichen Itza, were actually growing in power and influence during this period, absorbing population and energy from the collapsing south, entering their own period of cultural fluorescence. The collapse was not a global failure of Maya civilization as a whole. It was specifically and devastatingly a collapse of the great city-states of the southern lowlands, the oldest and most elaborate and most densely populated part of the Maya world, the part that had been building longest and had pressed its agricultural landscape hardest and had accumulated the most complexity and the most fragility simultaneously. The north survived. The south went quiet. And the question that has occupied scholars for 2 centuries, the question Stevens himself was asking when he stood in that clearing at Copan with the jungle pressing in on every side, is why? What broke the south? What combination of forces was sufficient to silence cities that had been burning for 6 centuries? The answer, when it finally came, was not simple. It was never going to be simple. It was a convergence, and each piece of it made the others worse, and the whole was considerably more devastating than any single cause could have been alone. Anyway, the rain stopped coming. As the decipherment progressed through the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, scholars found themselves confronting a picture of the classic Maya world dramatically different from the image Thompson and his predecessors had projected. And this was not a world of peaceful stargazers and priestly astronomers serenely contemplating the heavens in a tropical Eden undisturbed by political ambition and military violence. This was a world of intense and perpetual and often ruthless political competition in which warfare was not an aberration, but a structural feature woven into the economic and religious and artistic fabric of classic Maya civilization. Maya warfare of the classic period had a character that made it simultaneously more ritualized and more pervasive than warfare in many other ancient civilizations. Its goals were not primarily territorial in the modern sense. They were overwhelmingly oriented toward the capture of high-status enemies, rival kings, senior nobles, important military commanders, who could then be brought back to the victor's city and deployed in a carefully choreographed sequence of humiliation and ritual violence that served simultaneously as religious performance and political propaganda. The captured king, stripped of his regalia and sometimes of his fingers, was displayed as living proof of the victor's superior sacred power. His capture demonstrated that the winning king's relationship with the gods was stronger, his bloodletting rituals more effective, the supernatural forces aligned on his side. Eventually, the captive would typically be sacrificed in a major public ceremony, his death offered to the gods as the most prestigious possible gift. The artistic record of the classic period is saturated with this imagery. The stone monuments showing victorious kings in full regalia are standing above bound, kneeling captives who look upward with expressions of terror or resignation, the language of triumph carved into stone for centuries. And then there are the Bonampak murals, discovered in 1946. Still one of the most important and haunting single discoveries in the history of Maya archaeology. I'm going to spend a moment here because they deserve it, and because I find them hard to summarize without losing what makes them matter. The murals depict in extraordinary sequential detail an entire military campaign, the mobilization of the army in its jaguar pelt regalia and feathered headdresses, the battle itself, painted with a directness and a physical immediacy that has no parallel in classic Maya art, a chaos of bodies that presses against you from the wall, in that refuses the composed formality of the monument tradition. And then the aftermath, a hall of justice in which the victorious king and his nobles examine their prisoners. Some of the prisoners have had their fingernails torn out. Some appear dead or dying. Others reach imploringly toward their captors with bleeding hands. The Bonampak murals are dated to approximately 792 AD, precisely the period in which the classic collapse was beginning to accelerate. They are the work of a civilization under pressure, depicting warfare with a rawness and urgency that suggests it was no longer the controlled, ritualized competition of an earlier era. Something had changed in the quality of the violence. You can feel it in the paint. The intensification of warfare in the final century of the classic period is visible not just in art, but in the archaeology of the sites themselves. The Petexbatun region of what is now southwestern Guatemala offers one of the most detailed and most devastating case studies. A regional power centered at the city of Dos Pilas had, in the mid-8th century, pursued an aggressive policy of military expansion, tactical alliances, and military force projecting power over a wide area. The aggression triggered responses the Dos Pilas kings had not fully anticipated. Retaliatory alliances, counterattacks, escalating cycles of conflict drawing in more and more participants and consuming more and more resources. A spiral of violence that eventually overwhelmed not just Dos Pilas, but the entire regional system. The archaeological evidence from the final phase of Aguateca, the last capital of the Dos Pilas dynasty, is among the most extraordinary and most poignant in Maya archaeology. And this is where I find myself slowing down in a way I can't quite justify proportionally. But here we are. When Aguateca fell, it fell so suddenly, was abandoned so rapidly in the face of an advancing enemy force, that the normal processes of organized evacuation did not occur. Archaeologists excavating the structures in the 1990s and 2000s found intact assemblages of objects left exactly where they had been when their owners fled. Obsidian tools still in the workshops of craftsmen, ceramic vessels with food residues still inside them, grinding stones still in position on their kitchen floors, personal ornaments on the floors of elite residences in a city stopped mid-sentence. I don't know why that detail, the grinding stones still in position, hits harder than the others. It just does. I kept it. The warfare theory of the Maya collapse proposes that the endemic and ritualized military competition of the classic period, which had been a reasonably stable feature of the political system for centuries, underwent a catastrophic qualitative transformation in the late 8th century, shifting from controlled, limited, ritualized raiding to something more desperate and more total, a competition for survival in which the normal rules no longer applied. As cities began to face resource shortages, the competition for the best agricultural land and the most reliable water sources became existential, and the warfare became not a performance of royal power, but a struggle for the means of continued existence. Desperate warfare is almost by definition more destructive and harder to stop than the controlled violence of a functioning political system. Each city weakening its neighbors, each weakened neighbor less able to resist the next assault, the spiral tightening. But warfare alone doesn't quite reach back far enough. It explains the mechanism of the final crisis without fully accounting for why the crisis began when it did at this specific historical moment, after centuries in which the political system had managed endemic warfare reasonably successfully. Something changed conditions under which the system operated. Something removed the margins and the buffers that had previously kept the competition from becoming catastrophic. Yet something made the food unreliable. Something made the water uncertain. Something took the system that had been running at or near its limits for generations and pushed it past those limits at precisely the wrong moment, when the political tensions were already elevated, when the agricultural landscape was already stressed, when the populations were already too large for the land to easily support. That something was the environment. Specifically, it was the climate. And specifically, and this is where the science of the last 20 years has changed everything, it was drought. Not a single drought, a series of them. Intense, multi-year, precisely the kind of event that a civilization built on a promise of rain was least equipped to survive, least equipped even to understand. On because a drought severe enough to break the agricultural system was also in the theological framework of the classic Maya, evidence of something that could not be admitted, that the king's blood was not enough, that the bargain had failed, that the vision serpent rising from the burning paper was not delivering. The sky had stopped listening. and a civilization that had organized its entire intellectual and political and religious tradition around the proposition that it could hold the sky in place with its blood, was now facing the possibility that it could not, that the sky did not care. To stand in the central Petén forest of Guatemala today, in the areas around Tikal that have been protected as a national park, and that still bear something like the character of the ancient Maya landscape, is to feel the weight and presence of the living jungle in an almost physical way. The air saturated with moisture, light filtering down through multiple layers of canopy in green and golden shafts, the calls of birds and the drone of insects and the rustle of unseen creatures, creating the impression of a primordial world that has always been exactly like this. That impression is wrong. The tropical rainforest, for all its exuberant biological richness, is a remarkably fragile system. Its apparent fertility is not primarily a function of deep, nutrient-rich soils, but a function of the near-total recycling of nutrients through living biomass. Disrupt the living forest, cut it, burn it, expose bare soil to tropical sun and rain, and you interrupt the cycle. The nutrients leach away. The thin topsoil erodes, and the land becomes far less productive than it appeared to be, with a speed that is genuinely startling. The Maya of the classic period were not ignorant of this problem. Their sophisticated agricultural engineering represented an accumulated body of practical wisdom about how to sustain productivity in a difficult environment. But as the population of the southern lowlands grew to its 8th century peak, as the competitive dynamic of the classic period drove an escalating program of monumental construction, the demands being placed on the forest environment grew beyond what any amount of sophisticated management could fully compensate for. The demand for agricultural land was enormous. A large city like Tikal, with a population that may have reached 100,000 people, required a vast surrounding area of cultivated land just to feed itself. But the demand for construction materials, and specifically for lime plaster, was if anything more environmentally destructive. And this is a detail that tends to get less attention than it deserves, so I want to stay with it. The great Maya cities were not the bare grey stone structures they appear to be today. In their prime, they were covered in thick, smooth coatings of lime plaster, sometimes several layers thick. The tradition was to resurface major structures repeatedly over their lifetimes, each new surface painted in brilliant reds and yellows and blues and greens. The great white cities shining under the tropical sun were visible from miles away. They were built to be seen. They announced themselves. Lime plaster is made by burning limestone, heating it to very high temperatures until it converts to calcium oxide. This process requires enormous quantities of fuel. In the rainforest environment of the Maya lowlands, the only available fuel was wood, specifically large quantities of green hardwood timber. Archaeological analysis of wood ash and charcoal, combined with engineering calculations of fuel requirements, has allowed researchers to estimate the environmental cost of the Maya's architectural program with disturbing specificity. The production of enough lime plaster to resurface a single major pyramid at Tikal required the felling and burning of something in the range of several thousand acres of primary forest. The great cities were not resurfacing one pyramid. They were resurfacing dozens of structures repeatedly over centuries in a competitive architectural program that accelerated precisely during the period of the Classic period's greatest prosperity and confidence. Each city trying to outshine its rivals, each resurfacing requiring the forest to give more than it had given before. The cumulative environmental consequence projected across all the great cities of the southern lowlands over 5 centuries is staggering to contemplate. The landscape around the great cities, which at the beginning of the Classic period would have been a mosaic of forest and small agricultural clearings, was progressively transformed over those 5 centuries into something very different. An open, largely deforested landscape of agricultural fields and eroded hillsides. Isolated patches of forest remaining, and the thin tropical topsoil increasingly vulnerable to the seasonal rains. And we know this not from hypothetical calculations. We know it from the sediment. Scientists working in the lake basins of the Yucatan and the Petén region have extracted long sediment cores from lake bottoms that received runoff from the surrounding landscape throughout the period of Maya occupation. These cores contain a layered archive of environmental information, including fossilized pollen, an accurate record of the plant communities that surrounded the lake at any given point in the past. In the pollen record from the early Classic period, the profile of a heavily forested landscape, abundant tree pollen from species characteristic of tropical rainforest. As the Classic period progresses, and as the population grows and the cities expand, tree pollen declining, agricultural pollen and weed pollen increasing. In the layers corresponding to the late Classic period, tree pollen in some cores drops to levels suggesting something approaching nearly complete deforestation of the areas immediately surrounding the major cities. At the same time, the physical sediment itself changes character, coarser, thicker, deposited more rapidly, exactly the pattern you would expect from widespread erosion of denuded hillsides. The seasonal rains stripping topsoil from unprotected slopes and carrying it into the lake basins. These are not model projections. These are the physical traces of an actual environmental transformation recorded in the chemistry and biology of ancient lake sediments, and telling us with more directness than almost any other kind of evidence what the Maya of the southern lowlands had done to the landscape they lived inside. I need to pause here because I want to be careful about how this gets framed, because the framing matters. This was not stupidity. It was not carelessness. It was the inevitable consequence of the success of a complex growing civilization in a fragile environment, the same dynamic that has played out at different scales and in different contexts across human history in ways that I will not enumerate, because the list is long and the present tense makes it uncomfortable. And that is not where I intended to go tonight, but the recognition surfaces, and I let it surface, and then I keep moving. The loss of forest cover changes local hydrology, and without the root systems of the trees to absorb and slowly release rainfall, runoff becomes faster and more erosive during the rainy season. The soil retains less moisture during the dry season, making dry periods effectively longer and more severe. And the loss of forest eliminates the evapotranspiration of the trees. The process by which forests release water vapor into the atmosphere, which then falls as rain, potentially reducing regional rainfall in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The deforestation made drought more likely. The drought made the deforested landscape more vulnerable to the next drought. By the late 8th century, the classic Maya heartland was a civilization sitting on a knife's edge. The environmental buffers that had previously allowed the system to absorb shocks and recover from bad years, gone. In the soils thinner and less fertile, the water table lower, the forests that had moderated the local climate, largely stripped from the immediate surroundings of the great cities. The agricultural landscape pressed to its limits, feeding populations that had grown very large over a very long period of apparent abundance. Virtually no margin for error. Any prolonged departure from the expected seasonal pattern of rainfall capable of cascading into catastrophe. And then the sky changed. The Maya were, at the most fundamental level, a civilization built on a covenant with the rain, and the entire structure of their agricultural system, the cornfields and the raised field systems, and the elaborate reservoir networks that collected and stored the seasonal downpours for use during the dry months, was predicated on a specific pattern of rainfall, a pattern consistent enough for long enough that it had become the assumed foundation of everything. When the rains came on schedule in sufficient quantities, the corn grew and the cities ate. A single bad year, or 2 or 3 consecutive bad years, was a crisis but a survivable one, a departure from the norm that could be endured because the norm itself would return. But what if it didn't return? What if the departure from the norm was not a temporary disruption, but a sustained, decade-spanning, generation-spanning change in the fundamental behavior of the climate? What if the covenant with the rain was simply broken, not by any human failure, not by insufficient blood or imprecise ritual, but by a change in the atmospheric systems that governed the entire region's weather, a change that no amount of ritual could reverse? I want you to feel something here, if you can, something in the chest or the stomach, the particular quality of dread that comes not from sudden catastrophe, but from the slow realization that the thing you depended on absolutely is not coming back, that the sky you have been reading and interpreting and petitioning your entire life has become illegible, that the rain you were promised in return for everything you sacrificed is simply not falling, not late, not reduced, gone. In for much of the 20th century, drought was discussed as one possible contributing factor to the Maya collapse, but largely as theoretical speculation, plausible, unfalsifiable, floating, until the development of new analytical techniques gave paleoclimatologists a window into ancient climates of extraordinary precision. The technique that changed everything involves oxygen isotopes, specifically oxygen-16 and oxygen-18, which behave slightly differently in the water cycle. Heavier oxygen-18 being relatively more abundant in the carbonate mineral record during dry periods, lighter oxygen-16 more abundant during periods of heavy rainfall. By measuring the ratio of these isotopes in microscopic layers of cave formations, layers that, like the growth rings of a tree, record year by year the conditions under which they were formed, researchers can reconstruct the rainfall history of a region with remarkable temporal resolution. The cave systems of the Yucatan Peninsula and the Belize Highlands contain some of the most precisely dated and most extensively studied speleothem records in the world, when scientists extracted cores from stalagmites in these cave systems and analyzed their isotopic composition layer by layer. They found a record that was at once startling and grimly confirmatory. The period of the classic Maya's greatest prosperity and growth, roughly 300 to 600 AD, corresponded in the speleothem record to a sustained period of above average and reliable rainfall. The rains genuinely there during the centuries when the classic period was building toward its peak. The covenant holding, then beginning around 750 AD, coinciding with extraordinary precision with the first signs of the classic collapse in the archaeological record. The isotopic signal shifts sharply, unambiguously, and it stays shifted. The analysis indicates that the period from approximately 750 to 900 AD, the exact period during which the great cities of the southern lowlands fell silent one by one, was a period of sustained severe drought punctuated by a series of particularly intense multi-decadal drought episodes, unlike anything the civilization had experienced during its entire previous history. Independent confirmation comes from a second archive entirely. Sediment cores from the beds of the Yucatan's lakes, as in which researchers measured the concentration of gypsum, a mineral that precipitates from lake water in greater quantities during dry periods, when evaporation concentrates dissolved minerals. In the sediment layers corresponding to the late classic period, gypsum concentrations spike dramatically. A completely independent line of evidence, a completely different analytical technique, telling the same story. Two archives, two methods, one answer. The consequences of such a drought applied to a civilization already stressed by deforestation and degraded soils and escalating political conflict can hardly be overstated. Great reservoir systems that were the lifeblood of major cities like Tikal, enormous carefully engineered stone-lined catchment basins collecting and storing seasonal rainfall to provide water through the dry months, would have slowly emptied and failed to refill. The corn, already struggling in soils thinned by centuries of cultivation and erosion, would have failed. First in the most marginal fields, then in more and more of the agricultural hinterland. Famine would have followed, not in a single catastrophic season, but in a grinding cumulative progression as storage reserves depleted and the margin of survival narrowed with each successive failure. For the divine kings, the failure of the rains presented a crisis of a very specific and devastating kind. In their entire legitimacy, their entire claim to the power they held over thousands of lives rested on the promise that their rituals worked, that their bloodletting and their astronomical precision and their careful maintenance of the sacred calendar kept the cosmic order functioning and the rains falling when the corn needed them. As drought deepened and seasons failed and reservoirs dried and famine spread, the kings would have performed ever more desperate ritual acts, more bloodletting, more sacrifices, more elaborate ceremonies intended to petition the gods and ancestors for relief. The sky stayed silent, and in that silence, something more important than the corn was dying, and the belief system itself, the entire cosmological framework that had organized Maya society and justified the extraordinary power of the kings for more than 5 centuries, was being shown, season by season, failed harvest by failed harvest, to be untrue. The divine kings not divine, their rituals not working, the sacred covenant broken not by human failure, but by the climate itself, which had no interest in the bargain and no knowledge of what had been sacrificed to maintain it. In breaking the covenant, the drought broke not just the agricultural system, but the political system and the religious system and the social contract on which the whole was built. The king's legitimacy was not separate from his ability to make it rain. It was the same thing. When the rain stopped, the king stopped being a king in any sense that mattered, and the people, hungry, frightened, watching the reservoirs drop, began to make their own calculations. And now, before we follow the civilization into its final descent, I want to stop and leave something with you. I'm not going to answer it. It belongs in the dark, where you are. What is a king who cannot call the rain? What is a God who bleeds in the plaza before 10,000 witnesses and the sky stays indifferent? What do you do with your faith when the fundamental exchange at the center of your entire understanding of the world simply stops being honored? Because the Maya farmers watching their corn fail for the 3rd consecutive season were not watching a political crisis or an agricultural crisis or even a religious crisis in any compartmentalized sense. They were watching the universe itself stop making sense. And there is a quality of terror in that experience that no language fully captures, that no isotope ratio or sediment core can convey, that lives only in the imagination, only in a quiet hour when the noise has receded and you allow yourself to feel, even for a moment, what it would mean to believe in something absolutely and watch it fail absolutely. Perhaps that, more than any specific mechanism of drought or deforestation or warfare, is what the classic Maya collapse asks us to feel. Perhaps that is why you are here, listening in the dark. In the history of the classic Maya collapse as the accumulated weight of archaeological and scientific evidence now presents, it is the story of all 3 crises: endemic warfare and catastrophic drought and self-inflicted environmental disaster, arriving together and feeding into one another and amplifying each other's effects in a chain of consequences that the civilization, already stressed and already fragile, was unable to break. The sequence, as best as we can reconstruct it, ran something like this. The foundation for the disaster had been laid across centuries of success. The very achievements of the classic Maya, the population growth, the urban expansion, the monumental architectural programs had, through the relentless logic of resource consumption in a fragile tropical environment, systematically degraded the ecological basis of the civilization. By the mid-8th century, the soils around the great cities were thinner and less fertile, the forest cover largely gone. The local hydrology altered in ways that made drought conditions more severe and more prolonged than they would otherwise have been. The agricultural system, operating near its maximum productive capacity, with little reserve and little resilience, in the language of modern systems analysis, brittle, highly optimized for a specific set of conditions, extraordinarily productive when those conditions prevailed, dangerously vulnerable to any significant departure from them. Into this brittle world came the Drought, beginning around 700 to 50 AD, persisting with varying intensity but without any sustained recovery for more than a century, removing the one resource that even the most sophisticated agricultural engineering and the most elaborate reservoir system could not substitute for. The famine that followed was not a brief crisis. It was a prolonged, deepening emergency, and as food stores ran low and reservoirs dried and fields failed season after season, the political pressure on the kings became enormous, because from the perspective of the ordinary Maya farmer, the failure of the rains was the failure of the king, a failure of the divine covenant, a crack in the only explanation for the world that anyone had ever been given. The king faced an impossible situation. The crisis was not caused by any failure of his ritual action, but his authority depended entirely on the belief that it was his ritual action that kept the cosmos in order. So the kings performed more rituals, demanded more tribute to fund ever more elaborate ceremonial programs, and went to war because war was the other mechanism through which a king demonstrated his divine power when the sky would not cooperate. Here, the endemic warfare, which had been building its own momentum for independent reasons, merged catastrophically with the first crisis. The wars of the late Classic period were no longer the ritualized, limited conflicts of the High Classic era. They were wars fought by communities under existential pressure for control of the remaining productive resources. The fields that still received some rain, the water sources that had not yet dried, wars in which the careful distinction between the capture of elite enemies and the wholesale destruction of agricultural communities was progressively abandoned. Wars that pulled farmers away from their fields at precisely the moments when those fields needed the most intensive care. Wars that burned the agricultural infrastructure of defeated communities. Wars that shattered the trade networks that might otherwise have allowed resource sharing and mutual support between communities facing the same crisis. The more the drought drove communities to compete violently for scarce resources, the more the violence further degraded the resource base everyone depended on. The more the wars disrupted agricultural production, the more severe the famine became. The more severe the famine, the more desperate the competition for resources, and the more intense the violence. A feedback loop, a death spiral from which there was no exit available within the logic of the existing political system. And the third element, the environmental degradation, was not a separate crisis so much as the pre-existing condition that made the other two so much more devastating. Because in a landscape with healthy, intact forest cover and deep, rich soils, a century-long drought would have been terrible, but perhaps survivable. Communities able to retreat to smaller scale, less intensive agriculture. Forest products supplementing the diet. Soil protected by tree cover, maintaining more of its moisture. Coping mechanisms available. In the degraded landscape of the late Classic southern lowlands, those coping mechanisms were gone. The margin had been consumed by the centuries of success that preceded the collapse. The civilization had optimized itself into a corner. So the great machine of classic Maya civilization, which had been running with extraordinary efficiency and producing extraordinary results, for 5.5 centuries, ground to a halt, not all at once, not in a day or a year or even a decade, in the long, grinding, heartbreaking slowness of a system losing its capacity to sustain itself, shedding complexity and capability and population one piece at a time, becoming less and less able to perform the functions that defined it. The monuments stopped being carved, the kings stopped bleeding in the plazas, the scribes set down their brushes, the smoke stopped rising from the burning paper. The trade networks went quiet. The craftsmen produced less and less, and then nothing. The population contracted, then collapsed, then dispersed into the forest that was slowly, patiently, without urgency, reclaiming the plazas and the causeways and the pyramids that had briefly, brilliantly, heartbreakingly been the center of everything. The cities did not fall. They emptied. And that distinction matters because falling implies a moment, a violence, a before and an after with a clear line between them. Emptying is something else. Emptying is a process you can be inside without fully knowing it is happening. A family leaving, then another. The market a little thinner each cycle. The plaza a little quieter each ceremony. The king performing his ritual before a smaller and smaller crowd of witnesses until one day, and this is the detail I cannot stop returning to, on the one I find hardest to hold. One day, there is no one left to witness, and the ritual cannot be performed because the ritual requires an audience, and the audience has gone. The king stands alone in the plaza. The blood falls, the smoke rises, the sky says nothing. At some point, in the final decades of the classic period, in city after city across the southern Maya lowlands, the individual calculus of survival shifted. The question that every family and every farming community and every minor noble in the collapsing political system was asking, consciously or not, was no longer about loyalty or tradition or the obligations of the cosmic covenant. It was simpler, more urgent. Can we survive here? Can we feed our children here? Is there any realistic hope that the conditions making life in this city so difficult and so dangerous will improve? Or would our chances be better somewhere else, somewhere smaller, further from the centers of power and conflict, somewhere the soil might not yet be exhausted and the water might still be reliable? Left for more and more people across the decades of the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the answer was somewhere else. And so they left. The great exodus from the cities of the classic Maya southern lowlands was not a single event, not a migration in any organized sense. It was millions of individual decisions made over decades, each one responding to specific and local circumstances, each one representing a calculation about survival and the best path forward for a family or a small community. I want to try to make this specific. A farmer, his family, living for generations in the agricultural hinterland of one of the great cities, one of the tens of thousands of ordinary people whose labor in the cornfields provided the surplus that sustained the elaborate apparatus of the classic state. A man who has for his entire life lived within the framework of the classic Maya world, paying tribute to the local noble, participating in the great ceremonies of the agricultural calendar, watching the distant summits of the pyramid temples rise above the jungle canopy, feeling in his body the rhythm of planting and harvest and fallow that was also in his understanding of the world, the rhythm of cosmic time. The rains have failed for the third consecutive season. The family's stored corn from the last decent harvest is nearly gone. The tribute demands of the local administration have not decreased despite the failed harvests. If anything, they have increased, because the crisis has made the elites more desperate and more extractive, not less. The road to the city market, where he might once have traded craft goods or surplus produce, is now dangerous. Armed men moving through the region. Travelers in small groups have been attacked. His daughter is thin. His youngest child is sick with the kind of sickness that comes from not eating enough of the right things. The rumor is that a community 3 days' walk to the north found good water last season and had a reasonable harvest of beans and squash. One night, after whatever conversation or meditation or whispered prayer marks the moment of a decision that will change everything, the family gathers its portable possessions. A few ceramic vessels, some tools, the seeds saved from the last harvest, whatever food remains, and they walk away. They leave behind the stone house that their grandfather built, the terraced hillside field that their family has worked for 4 generations, the world they have always known, the stone pyramids on the skyline that have defined the physical and spiritual geography of their entire lives. They do not know they are participating in the collapse of a civilization. They are trying to feed their children. This decision, made in its hundreds of thousands of iterations across the southern Maya lowlands over more than a century, is what the archaeology records. The population of the great cities declining not primarily through famine deaths or war deaths, though both contributed, but through this gradual, persistent outflow of people making rational survival decisions in increasingly desperate circumstances. The great ceremonial centers were the first to show signs of abandonment. Elite residents departing or dying, squatter populations moving in for a time, camping in the shells of the palaces with their crude cooking hearths on fine plaster floors. These successor populations were themselves temporary. The same pressures that drove the original inhabitants away eventually drove them away too, or reduced them through attrition, the markets emptying, the workshops falling silent, the priests who remained performing their rituals before increasingly empty plazas, and then those too departed. The final stages of abandonment, the cities must have been extraordinary places to be inside. Enormous stone complexes half empty. The population shrunk to a fraction of its former size. The maintenance of the great structures no longer possible with the remaining labor force. The trees and vines already beginning their slow encroachment on the edges of the plazas. The howler monkeys whose territories had been pushed back by the noise and activity of the great city beginning to return. Their extraordinary voices filling the spaces where the chanting of priests and the noise of the marketplace had once been constant. Then the last people went too, and the jungle came, not dramatically, patiently, seeds blowing into cracks in the plaster of the great plazas, small plants taking root, their roots widening the cracks, larger plants establishing themselves in the accumulating organic debris at the base of stone walls, and the great Ramon trees whose roots are capable of penetrating and splitting stone, finding their purchase in the joints of carefully fitted masonry and beginning their century-long work of dismantling. The steep sides of the pyramid temples, no longer maintained by human labor, beginning to erode, seasonal rains loosening the stucco surfaces and sweeping them down into the growing vegetation below, earth accumulating on the terraced surfaces of the steps, seeds germinating in that accumulated earth. Within 2 or 3 generations, within the lifetimes of the grandchildren of the last people to live in the city, the pyramid temples that had once been the most visible man-made structures in hundreds of miles of flat jungle had become, to any eye that did not know to look for them, indistinguishable from natural hills. And the silence was complete. And here, right here, is where I want to bring you back to where we began. Back to that image of the colossal stone pyramids above the jungle canopy. Back to that quality of silence that is not empty. You understand now what that silence actually is. It is the silence of something that transformed, of a system that reached its limits and dissolved and released the people it had held into a different kind of life. The civilization did not die. It came apart, and the people who had been inside it walked out into smaller and more dispersed and more mobile lives, carrying their languages and their calendars and their knowledge of the corn, and their descendants are there still. 7 million people, going about their days in the same lands, speaking the languages their ancestors spoke, weaving the colors, planting the corn, counting the sacred days in a calendar that has been running without interruption for longer than the cities stood. The cities did not defeat them. The cities were one thing they made. When that thing became impossible to sustain, they made other things. They survived the failure of the cosmic covenant, the failure of the divine kings, the failure of the rains, the failure of the soils, the failure of everything that was supposed to hold the world in place. They kept counting. That is what the silence is. That is what the dark has been holding for you tonight. If this journey was worth your time, and I hope it was, I mean that simply, without performance, please leave a like and subscribe, and leave me something in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are right now, because these stories travel into corners I'll never see and arrive at hours I'll never share. And there is something quietly extraordinary about that, something I find I cannot fully articulate, which is maybe fitting. The stone cities are not ruins, they are evidence. Rest well. The story of the classic Maya collapse does not end with the silence. It never does. The collapse of the classic period city-state system of the southern lowlands was not the extinction of the Maya people. It was the extinction of a specific political and economic and social order, a highly elaborate and resource-intensive way of organizing human life that had reached the limits of what its environment could sustain. The people who had built that system, who had been its subjects and its victims, did not disappear. They dispersed. They adapted. They survived. In the northern Yucatan Peninsula, the late classic and early post-classic periods saw a remarkable cultural fluorescence at cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal that reached their peak of elaboration and political power precisely during and after the period when the southern lowland cities were falling silent. These northern cities developed a somewhat different character, more cosmopolitan, more influenced by the cultures of central Mexico, more oriented toward maritime trade, but unmistakably Maya in their fundamental cultural orientation, in their calendar systems and writing system and agricultural traditions and cosmological framework. The thread held. The El Castillo Pyramid at Chichen Itza, the Temple of Kukulkan, remains one of the most precisely cosmologically calibrated structures in the ancient Americas. At the equinoxes, the angle of the afternoon sun on its northwest corner produces a shadow pattern on the northern staircase that creates the visual illusion of a great serpent descending from the summit to the earth. A shadow serpent that animates slowly as the sun moves, as if the stone itself were alive. This was not an accident. It was the deliberate, calculated product of centuries of astronomical observation and architectural precision, a demonstration that the Maya capacity for integrating cosmological knowledge into built form had not diminished even as the political system of the South was collapsing. The South went quiet, and the North built a pyramid that tells time with shadows. I find I don't quite have the right response to that, so I'll just leave it there. Even after the power of the great northern cities waned, even through the turbulent centuries of the post-classic period, even through the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, a conquest that brought not just military violence, but epidemic disease and forced conversion and the systematic destruction of Maya books and records. The fundamental dismantling of traditional social and political structures, the burning of the bark paper books in which centuries of astronomical observation and historical record and cosmological knowledge had been preserved, an act whose specific gravity I find. No, I'll keep moving. The Maya people endured. They endured by doing what they had always done in moments of systemic crisis, retreating from large urban centers to smaller communities where the basic agricultural traditions could be maintained, preserving what was most essential of their cultural inheritance in those smaller communities, the languages, the calendar knowledge, the agricultural traditions, the oral histories, the religious practices woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that they could survive even the loss of the great ceremonial centers and the formal institutions of the political system. The things that live in the hands and the voice and the memory of families, which are harder to destroy than pyramids. Today, more than 7 million Maya people live in their ancestral homelands across southern Mexico and Guatemala and Belize and Honduras and El Salvador. Not archaeological curiosities, not museum exhibits, living human communities with full and complex contemporary lives, maintaining a relationship with their cultural inheritance that is active and creative rather than passive or nostalgic. More than 30 distinct Mayan languages are still spoken across this region, some of them by millions of speakers. In the highland communities of Guatemala, women still weave textiles on backstrap looms using patterns and color traditions, carrying symbolic meanings rooted in ancient cosmological frameworks. The colors mean something. They have always meant something. The meaning survived. In Yucatecan villages, the ceremony of the Huachicol, a rain petition ritual invoking the Chark rain deity, is still performed by communities that have maintained an unbroken connection to that practice across 5 centuries of colonial disruption. The rain is still being petitioned, and the conversation between the human world and the sky is still ongoing, still unresolved, still worth having. In the highlands of Chiapas, the Zeltal and Tzotzil Maya communities maintain calendar knowledge and ritual traditions that scholars have traced back through documentary sources to the pre-conquest period. The classic Maya collapse destroyed a specific, elaborate, resource-intensive, politically hierarchical way of organizing society. And the people, deprived of that system, fell back on their essential cultural resources, their languages, their agricultural knowledge, their cosmological frameworks, their social bonds, and used those resources to build a different way of life, less spectacular in some ways than the way of life of the great cities, more durable, more flexible, more successful in the end as a strategy for long-term human survival, less visible to the scholarship that arrived centuries later looking for pyramids, less legible to the colonial imagination that needed ruins to confirm its own narrative of supersession, less photogenic, perhaps, than the temples breaking through the canopy. But here, still counting the days in a calendar that has been running without interruption for longer than the cities stood, still planting the corn in the knowledge. Not metaphorical knowledge, not symbolic knowledge, but the deep agricultural knowledge carried in the hands of people who have been doing this specific thing in this specific landscape for a very long time. That the corn is also them, that they are also the corn. That the cycle of planting and growth and harvest and fallow is the cycle of cosmic time, and that to plant is to participate in the act of creation, and that to harvest is to receive the gift of life renewed. The divine kings are gone, the plazas are empty, the pyramids are hills, and the people who built all of it are still here, still weaving, still planting, still counting, still in conversation with the sky that does not always answer, but that they have not stopped addressing, because that is what you do when the thing you were promised fails, and the universe stops making sense, and the cities fall silent one by one across a century and a half of grinding loss. You don't stop talking to the sky. You find a smaller place to stand. You plant what seeds you have. You count the days. You keep going. That is the story. That is what the dark has been holding. And so we come back, as we must, to where we began, to the paradox I offered you at the start, which I think you understand now in a way you couldn't have before we made this journey together. The silent cities are the abandoned capitals of a living people, a people who left them behind, not because they were defeated or destroyed, but because the cities had ceased to serve the purpose for which cities exist, the support and enhancement of human life. When the cities could no longer fulfill that purpose, the people chose life over cities. In making that choice, they survived. The story of the classic Maya, in all its beauty and tragedy and complexity and ultimate resilience, is not finished. It is not even properly speaking old. It is the story of a people who are still here, still living in the shadow of their extraordinary ancestors, still weaving, still farming, still counting the days. And the story of what brought the great cities low, the perfect storm of endemic warfare and catastrophic sustained drought and centuries of self-inflicted environmental degradation, is not a simple cautionary tale of civilizational hubris and divine punishment. It is something far more complicated and far more human than that framing allows. the drought that appears to have provided the decisive final blow was not caused by the Maya. It was a climatic shift driven by large-scale atmospheric dynamics that would have occurred regardless of whether the Maya had built cities in its path or not. But the civilization the drought destroyed had made itself more vulnerable to that drought by depleting the environmental resources that might otherwise have buffered it. A civilization with intact forest soils and a healthy hydrology and a diverse, resilient agricultural system might have survived a century of severe drought at terrible cost, but without total collapse. The classic Maya civilization, by the time the drought arrived, had used up much of that resilience, had spent it on the white-plastered cities and the towering pyramids and the centuries of monumental construction that were also, simultaneously, its greatest achievement and its greatest vulnerability. This is not a story unique to the Maya. Across the sweep of human history, the largest and most complex societies have tended to consume the resources that sustain them in proportion to their size and ambition, and to become through that consumption more vulnerable to environmental variability than the smaller and simpler societies they replaced. The Maya are a particularly well-documented and particularly vivid example of this general pattern. They are not unique in it, and the lessons their story offers are not comfortable ones. They suggest that the most impressive human achievements, the greatest cities, the most sophisticated technologies, the most elaborate social and cultural systems are not guarantees of permanence. They suggest that success, by creating conditions of greater complexity and greater resource consumption, can itself become a source of vulnerability. Did they suggest that the relationship between a civilization and the natural world that sustains it is not a background condition, but an active and dynamic element of the historical drama that can, when pushed beyond its tolerances, become the most powerful historical force of all? I won't press further than that. The application is not difficult to find, and I don't think you need me to find it for you. But there is another lesson in the Maya story that deserves to be held alongside the sobering ones. The divine kings of the classic period, with all their bloodletting rituals and their magnificent pyramids and their obsessive calendar keeping, are gone. The great cities they built are silent. The political system they presided over is no more. And yet, in the highlands of Guatemala, a woman sits at her bagstrap loom and weaves colors and patterns that her grandmother taught her and her grandmother's grandmother taught before that. Patterns whose symbolic meanings connect to a cosmological system that was already ancient when the first stones of Tikal were laid. A daykeeper in the mountains of Chiapas lights candles before a domestic altar and recites the names of the days in the 260-day Tzolk'in calendar, names that scribes carved into the stone of the Great Pyramids more than 1,000 years ago. A farmer in the Yucatan plants his milpa corn with practices and prayers that would be recognizable in their essential spirit to the farmers who grew corn in the shadow of the pyramids of Chichen Itza. 10 centuries passed. The cities fell silent. The people did not. In this distinction between a civilization and a people, between what is essential and what is expendable in a culture, between what survives the failure of systems and what is lost when the great structures fall is the most important thing the story of the classic Maya collapse has to tell us. Because beneath the elaborate superstructure of the classic political system maintained in the daily practice and the oral memory and the agricultural rhythm of millions of ordinary people was something more durable and more fundamental than any pyramid, something that could not be burned or buried or conquered or dried out by a century of drought. That thing survived. Standing before the great North Acropolis of Tikal at dusk, watching the last light turn the ancient stone warm and gold while the howler monkeys begin their evening symphony, somewhere deep in the canopy below, it is not difficult to feel the weight of what was lost here. The accumulated human effort and ingenuity and spiritual imagination that raised these stones and carved these texts and painted these walls and then slowly, grinding, heartbreakingly, let them go. The weight is real. The loss is real. But the Maya people who walk the same land today, who carry in their languages and their agricultural traditions and their ritual practices the living inheritance of this culture, they are not the ruins. They are not the echo. They are the continuation. And if this journey was worth your time, and I hope it was, I mean that simply, please subscribe, leave a like. It truly makes this work possible to continue. And the next chapter of this story, the great northern fluorescence that followed the southern silence, is waiting, and you need only be here to receive it. Now, I want you to do something for yourself, something simple and immediate. Let the weight of what you've carried today, all of it, the urgent and the unfinished and the unresolved, let it move from wherever it has been sitting in your body, your chest, your jaw, your shoulders. Let it move downward and outward, into the mattress, into the floor, into the deep, patient earth below. Because the earth has been holding civilizations for a very long time, and it knows what to do with weight. The silent cities sleep beneath their canopy of green. The howler monkeys call across the dark. Somewhere in the highlands, a woman's hands move across the loom in the old patterns. Somewhere, a farmer checks the sky for rain. Somewhere, a daykeeper whispers the names of the days. And the days keep turning as they have always turned, patient, indifferent, beautiful. And you, wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever hour the darkness has found you, you are part of this long, unbroken human story too. That is enough, more than enough. The silent cities sleep, the people wake. Good night.